The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
La situation est difficile sur le plan budgétaire, sur le plan financier. Je suis aussi très vigilant sur les marchés financiers que je connais assez bien. Très difficile sur le plan économique et social, je viens de vous le dire.
That was French Prime Minister Michel Barnier speaking about the country's difficult budgetary situation last week before he lost a no-confidence vote that forced his resignation. France is now facing yet another crisis as it has no obvious path to delivering a fresh budget. Amid this uncertainty, what will happen to the country's borrowing costs? Will President Emmanuel Macron survive? These questions and more are the focus of this week's Viewsroom. Welcome back to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that invites you, the listener, into a lively discussion with Breakingviews columnists. I'm your host, Amy Donlan. Michel Barnier's plan was attempting to tackle France's rising debt. Under his proposals, public debt could have risen to 113% of GDP and then 116% by 2026 before declining slowly. Shrinking the deficit via fairly modest spending cuts like freezing state pensions below inflation levels for 6 months were considered too drastic. But all of this instability will make it even harder for France to grow its economy. Meanwhile, French stocks are down, the country's main market has declined 10% since June and is underperforming all other major European exchanges. Thankfully, we have two experts in both France and economics with us today. We are joined by Pierre Briançon, who is covering the situation in France very closely, and Francesco Guerrera, our global head of economics at Breakingviews. Pierre, Francesco, you are very welcome.
Hi, Amy.
Good to be here.
So Pierre, I think it's best to maybe start with you. I wondered if you could talk us through why France's economy is in so much trouble at the moment.
Well, to begin with, we have to realize that the current crisis is mostly a political crisis more than an economic or budgetary fiscal financial crisis. And the political paralysis of the government with a hung parliament and a marginalized president, no discernible majority in parliament, no party having enough votes to even, command a kind of relative majority or anything. That led to a coalition government hastily convened by Macron, and the impossibility in a moment where France's fiscal deficit is really getting out of control, with deficit at 6% of GDP this year, which is twice the EU authorized limit. The conjunction of a deep political crisis, political mess we should call it, and the necessity to make really tough decisions in terms of fiscal, to address the fiscal deficit and hopefully stabilize the public debt load. This proved impossible, and this is what Macron realized last week when his prime minister was ousted by parliament.
So Pierre, that's fascinating. Francesco, I wonder if I could bring you in here. Just how would you assess from an economics perspective? I mean, there's many countries dealing with deficits. How would you assess Michel Barnier's plans for the deficit? I mean, were they quite radical? Would they have been effective in tackling the ballooning debt?
The plans were very conservative, right, with a small c, and the fact that they weren't even able to push those through proved what Pierre was saying. And actually, as Pierre was ticking off all the situation in France, as an Italian, this sounded depressingly familiar. So you have a political mess, you have a fiscal situation that is untenable, the need to take tough decisions, but the unwillingness or the inability of the political class to do it. So what we're witnessing here is the Italianification of France. Now, the question is how much the markets take these parallels to the limit, right? So we've seen as a crisis in the bonds of France, in the government bonds of France. The spread, the distance between the yield between the French bonds and the German bonds has been widening, but we haven't seen any contagions to other European government bonds. We haven't seen a widespread bond crisis of the kind we witnessed in Europe in the 2010s. So at the moment, the situation, as far as the markets are concerned, is limited to France, which is the Eurozone's second largest economy, but it's not spreading to the rest of the Eurozone. That's a good news. The bad news, as Pierre was saying, is that it's difficult to see how France gets out of this political and fiscal hole.
I think of that idea, though, of the Italianification of France is quite an interesting one, though, Francesco. And Pierre, I'd love to bring you in here as well. France and Germany are the sort of power, right, of Europe. And there is a war going on the eastern side with Ukraine and Russia. So having a weakened France is I would have thought, problematic, given that we've got Donald Trump, who's obviously going to take a more kind of protectionist, I would say, not intervening in situations. I mean, how do you think that's likely to play out, having this quite big distraction of the economy for France?
I think it's a major problem. Again, as Francesco pointed out, this is not a market crisis. We should discard any tempting analogy with the euro crisis from 12 years ago, Greece, etc. Forget about that. The spread widened a little bit. It has remained relatively stable in the last few weeks. But remember, thanks to the ECB interest rates, so yields, absolute yields are declining in any case. So France is actually paying less to borrow than it did 2 months ago. So we're not talking about an immediate crisis, the euro imploding or anything. But this will have lasting economic consequences. France is the only country, major European country, that has not decreased its debt load since the after-COVID year. Debt loads throughout Europe blew up because of COVID, because of a need for massive public investment. But all governments took steps to shrink the debt load, including, by the way, Italy. When we talk about the Italianization of France nowadays, remember that, by the way, Italy has a stable government, and Italy shrank its public debt load by 15 percentage points since the post-COVID highs. So there's a lot to... Italy is almost becoming a role model for France, if you want. Not quite there yet. This
is all quite a change.
Remember, the Barnier plan was aiming at shrinking the budget deficit by a small 1% of GDP by next year, going from 6%, which is very high, to 5%, which is also very high. But it was only the first step of a multi-year program approved by the EU to really, take the situation to really address France's fiscal situation and really, stabilize at least the debt load. If you don't do that now, and all political parties, the reason Barnier failed was that every single political party had a lot of idea about more spending and less taxes, which is exactly the opposite, of course, of what needs to be done. Each party individually, the far left, the center left, the far right, has its own ideas about what we should do, which taxes we should raise, on the rich on one hand, on the poor, on the middle class on the other hand. And so they cannot agree. There's no consensus to be built to even agree on minimum steps to shrink the budget deficit, which is the heart of the current problem. But this will have consequences, because if you cannot, take down the deficit by next year and the year thereafter, then it increases the debt load. Debt service, what France pays to pay back each year in interest payments, is already higher than the defense budget. You were talking about Ukraine and the void at the head of Europe between France and Germany, uncertainty. We're talking, debt service is higher than what France spends on its military, which has already increased, by the way, in the last few years. And so you have an idea of the size and the scope of the problem there. And unfortunately, there are very little reasons to be optimistic, because no one quite sees the way out of this, at least until the current parliament cannot agree on even a minimum program.
But I think it's interesting, this idea, right? Because, I mean, you're talking about the yields going down, right? So the borrowing costs are actually reducing. And Francesco, I'm just sort of curious because when we look back to the last financial crisis where countries were struggling with growth and austerity, cutting, coming up with all these policies that reduced pensions and things like that were all brought in, and people looked back and thought it wasn't really the right approach. So is that similar to what we're seeing here with France, as in this is a country with stagnant growth, the borrowing costs are declining? I mean, is there an argument that they shouldn't be cutting?
I mean, the rule, generally speaking, and we saw this in the previous financial crisis, including countries like the UK, you shouldn't really go for a crash diet of austerity. You shouldn't, hammer the economy with a sharp decrease in spending or a sharp increase in taxes. And of course, this is exactly, as Pierre was saying, where France is going, right? So if they don't take action now and they are unable to do it, this political stalemate is likely to last for months. All that means that at some point, they will have to have a much harsher austerity in a shorter period of time than they had before. And that has a domino effect on the growth picture for the whole of the Eurozone, because the Eurozone growth is very fragile, is essentially stagnating. And if you have a bout of austerity down the line in the second largest economy, you will get in trouble because you will not have one of the growth engines, France, fire on all cylinders, right? So that's the situation that the Eurozone finds itself in, right? In theory, this should be a good time to introduce fiscally responsible measures, because on one hand, you have a growth picture which is not terrible, but not fantastic. But at the same time, you go interest rates coming down. The European Central Bank has started cutting interest rates after really raising them during the COVID period to fight inflation. So a period in which interest rates are coming down is a good time to take, to put your fiscal house in order. But in this case, France, and there's other countries as well, are going to miss the boat, and then they'll have to take much tougher, much harsher action afterwards. And that's not just limited to France. In the Eurozone, there's about 7 countries already in breach of the own European Union rules on fiscal deficits.
I think it is very important that you have to realize also that the current crisis it itself slowly pulling France into a terrible spiral, because uncertainty already will have an economic impact. French households' savings rate is at 19%, which is the highest since the 1970s. It's already very high in the Eurozone at 15 to 16% on average, 19%. French businesses, would you invest in a country that doesn't have a government, doesn't know what to do with its finances? There are signs that foreign investors, they're not pulling out, but maybe they're not coming in. Already indications that Japanese investors are keeping away from French debt, but you're talking about direct investment, etc. I mean, Macron had a big splash a few months ago, inviting all the big, CEOs from the world over, saying this is the time to invest in France, etc. Would you now, if you're looking at France, is it the time to do it? So it already has an impact down the road, less consumption, less investment. And so you see how things could turn sour economically very quickly.
Yes. And the idea of as well, this instability, because there is one stable force, right, that has been in France for a long time now, which is Emmanuel Macron, the president. Where does he go from?
You mean here? Stable from the institutional viewpoint?
Yeah, and from the fact that he's been there, he's very much like a presence. He's been a sort of stable force all through COVID and prior to that as well. So as in, you have, obviously, his prime minister has resigned, or forced to resign. So what does this all mean for him?
Well, it means that it was a big mistake, probably, that to call snap elections in June. No one understood why he did it, and he hasn't really explained what was he hasn't convinced, at least, on the rationale behind it. His only power is to appoint a new prime minister, and so to choose basically whether he wants to include the center left, the Socialist Party, in the new government. But once he's done that, he has very little power in such a situation. He's still a big influence on foreign policy and defense policy, but in terms of domestic policy, this is the prime minister's remit. And so once he appoints a new prime minister, which says he will do in the next 48 hours, the big question for him is whether he tries to. He basically chose the center-right coalition with Barnier, with a tacit understanding that the far right of Marine Le Pen would not vote a non-confidence, would not agree on a non-confidence vote. This failed because, as we saw, Le Pen at the end decided to send the government home. If he broadens the coalition, trying to split the united left and try to bring in the center-left socialists, he may have a chance to, the next prime minister may have a chance to come up with a budget that would at least last for the coming year.
Because that's the sort of question I was wondering, is like, you mentioned, Pierre, that obviously lots of the other parties in France are coming up with plans that don't involve cuts, that, are, basically to keep things going as they are, keep spending. And Francesco, I wondered what happens if France is unable to pass a budget that does cut some of the spending, that does try and reduce the deficit. I mean, there is obviously the example of the UK where, Liz Truss, the very brief Prime Minister of the UK, did attempt to do a kind of all guns blazing spend when the finances were not good. And investors reacted really badly to that.
Yeah, France has the ability to pass a budget that keeps the lights on, right? So there's no cliff edge, like, for example, you have in the US, for example. So there isn't that. The kind of extreme case scenario is very, very unlikely in France. However, as you point out, if there is stalemate, if they start playing around with budgets that don't do what they need to do, which is consolidate fiscally, then you are playing with fire with the markets. Now, you may not have that kind of moment of crisis, like very acute moment of crisis that the UK had 2 years ago, but you certainly you can have a steady increase in the yields. And that's, as Pierre was pointing out, it's a difficult situation to be in for any country. More importantly, you have a situation where, the investor confidence in the Eurozone as a whole, both economically, right? Because as we said, the growth is very low, it's very slow. And also from an investment perspective, is very weak. And that's a very important moment. Obviously, investors have relative choices to make, and they have other options to invest their money. And if you think about a place like the United States, where, the new administration could be very kind of pro-investing and could attract more investment with, again, fiscal measures there, or indeed other places in the world, you can see that Europe is in a very difficult situation when it comes to international investors.
And then, Pierre, I suppose lastly, I'm sort of curious about Marine Le Pen and all of this, because she is obviously the leader of the far right, and she wants, I think, to take power. Does this instability give her an opening to do that?
It's really bizarre and a little bit like Macron. It's a bit hard to understand exactly her tactic, or not even talking about strategy here. She wants to become president. The next presidential election is in 2027. She's been calling for Macron's resignation, and he said, "No way, Jose, I'll stay here until 2027, until the end of my term." Why she brought down the government, decided to do that at this particular moment, is strange, and it seems to be proven by the latest polls showing that she has lost a bit of her mojo, of her popularity by doing that. She remember the whole thing for Marine Le Pen is to tend to prove to the French that she's able to be president and to govern. While every single time when her party, whatever it was called, was near, almost there, the French en masse, decided, coalesced and decided to vote against her. So she only, at the last minute, the French decide they're not ready, we don't want her, we don't want them. She's trying to overcome that terrible hurdle when you're a politician aspiring to, the highest job. And she fails to convince for now that she's able to do that. Voting for the non-confidence vote, which also is another thing coming from the French political class that voters don't understand, probably doesn't serve her. But again, it's a long time, 2.5 years until the next presidential election is a long time in politics.
Absolutely. Well, as you said, one of the biggest economies in Europe, at a time of, I think, that where everyone is looking for stability from Europe. So there's plenty to watch and plenty to write on. Pierre, Francesco, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tashlich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Viewsroom every Thursday on the Reuters app or your favourite platform. And don't forget to tune in to our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you heard, please follow The Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.